Hello, everyone. My name is Ethan Bresnahan. I'm a marketing manager here at CyberSaint. Welcome to today's webinar, Why the Shift to Remote Work is Driving IRM Adoption. Today, I'm joined by CyberSaint Principal Solutions Architect, Steve Torino. Before we go ahead and get started, again, as always, this recording will be available on our Bright Talk channel following the presentation today. And please feel free to submit questions throughout the presentation. So with that, welcome back, Steve. Always good to chat. A lot of what we've been thinking about, especially in the context of remote work, I think everyone's kind of tired of hearing the word pandemic. But one of the long-term residual effects that we're clearly seeing is that remote work seems to be sticking. So to kind of give us a little context and kick things off, I kind of want to talk through the experience of a typical risk and compliance team member pre-pandemic. What can you kind of talk us through what those workflows look like and what that sort of experience was before the pandemic when we were all still in the office?
Yeah, so I think of it kind of in a couple of different phases, right? You have the phase where you're gathering information. That's usually an assessment process against some sort of standard framework. That's something that's been getting more and more complex over time because as we have additional regulatory requirements placed on us, or maybe we have even requirements placed on us by our customers, for things like, let's say, a voluntary certification like a SOC 2 or ISO 27001. A lot of these assessments, though, whatever reasons you have for complying with them, they're kind of saying the same thing. They're just saying it in slightly different ways. And typically those would be performed on some cadence, probably annually is the most common. Some organizations might be doing a little more frequently based on the types of systems and whatnot. But the reality is that the majority of people contributing to assessments, it's really not their day job, right? So thinking of things like talking to a sysadmin and getting a configuration screenshot, or talking to somebody who's completely even out of the IT realm, like a human resources manager, to test some controls and make sure that onboarding and offboarding of employees during whatever testing period has been performed the way that it was supposed to be. But I think one of the challenges in this information gathering phase is because a lot of the respondents to these questions, it's not really their full-time job. Compliance can be low, or at least low in terms of the timeline that maybe the assessment team wants to wrap things up in. So one of the benefits to being together in an office is that just normal human interaction, you have the ability to run into somebody in the lunchroom or the cafeteria, or just march over to somebody's desk if you really need something fast. And that human element of getting people to do what you need them to do.
Yes, and sort of that simple like the follow process is not as intentional as it is now, where you have to go out of your way and make sure that whoever's doing what they're supposed to be doing is doing it.
Right.
So juxtaposing sort of that experience where I think a lot of the theme that you were just kind of covering was this idea of it kind of just happened. Like when there was no real sort of purpose. It was more so, this is the objective and we're going to figure out how to do it along the way. And so I think a major theme of the shift to remote work, and I think a lot of teams struggled with this regardless of the function, was this notion of having to be a lot more direct and a lot more practical with the way that you approached a project, right? So 14 months later, remote work is still this persistent trend that seems to not be going anywhere. What do those workflows look like for those risk teams now?
Yeah. Well, first of all, just a comment that it did just happen. I remember you and I were in DC.
Yep.
The office was closed.
Indeed. Yep. It seems like a lifetime ago. That was crazy.
It sure does, yeah. Well, a couple things there. So one, you mentioned 14 months later, and that sticks out at me a little bit because, as we mentioned before, the most common assessment kind of cadence would be every 12 months. So
yes,
we actually had up until now organizations that hadn't even necessarily fully assessed themselves, despite all of the different changes that had been going on. And so I think pretty much everyone has kind of gone through that process and is maybe finding some information that they didn't even know in terms of how that impacted the risk. But yeah, I mean, I think risk teams are dealing with the same thing that everyone else is: the sprawl of different communication technologies that are out there to connect with people. And some people prefer Teams, and some people prefer Zoom or Google Chat or Slack, or just a old-fashioned phone call. So there's that part of it as well. And just maybe it has to be a little more intentional reach out to somebody than just kind of, be in the lunchroom, as we mentioned before.
For sure. And so as far as some of the greater impacts here, you talked about the fact that to your point that especially with a 12-month assessment cycle, that at this point, everyone has gone or is going through sort of this shift in sort of absorbing remote work as part of the assessment workflow.
Mm-hmm.
I kind of want to drill more so into some of the impacts of a lot of the technology that got adopted, especially with digital transformation going from sort of this pie in the sky concept to now being a very practical and very sort of board level immediate issue. The adoption of things like cloud, a lot of new SaaS technologies getting integrated into the tech stack, a lot of new technology in general. What are you seeing as sort of some of the greatest impact from whether that's people, process, or technology? What are you seeing as some of the greatest impacts of this shift?
Yeah, it's definitely all of the above. Certainly cloud is a major one. There's been rapid adoption of cloud. Whenever we say rapid adoption, that probably means the risk assessment wasn't done before you did it. Right? And even some of the technologies that we have adopted, like early on, around this time last year, everyone's moving to Zoom, and then a month or so later, Zoom's in a lot of hot water because of Zoom bombing and all this other stuff. Part of it is maybe sometimes there's vulnerabilities in technology, but probably more often than not, the risk is in how people are deploying it and like how you're getting the settings configured and all that kind of stuff. So when you jump into something that's new, and that Zoom is an example of an application that you can just buy and everyone can download on their workstation. That's relatively easy. But you also saw things like organizations where their points of egress couldn't handle so much inbound traffic from all these remote users, and so they had to switch in some cases to virtual private cloud networks and things like that. And even really experienced network engineers who really know what they're doing, if they've not worked in Google Cloud, Azure, AWS, setting up these things, there is a learning curve. It's not really fair to say, because you're a good network engineer and can configure a firewall on-prem, that means you can switch everything over to AWS without, any learning curve, right? But then even by extension, beyond cloud, we also saw things like with the shortage in the supply chain of PCs, and trying to get those to people as fast as possible. There could be a tendency sometimes to skip some of the hardening steps, right? Because usually you would get an order of 50 or 100 laptops at a time, and then your help desk would go through, harden them. They whitelist certain things, blacklist certain things, whatever the case may be, and then you have a process to deploy it. That was all over the place too, right? So you have now assets that maybe aren't going through the same process that they used to. But then I think probably for me, the biggest one really has been more around the people and process, just the decentralization of things and changes in process out of necessity. Even using a non-IT example from accounts payable, we've had a process where accountant one prints out a check, signs it to their authority level, and then walks it across the hall to the controller who has a higher authority level to sign a check. How do you do that when two people are sitting, potentially across the country? And those types of processes were definitely exploited because when there's uncertainty or doubt, that's a great opportunity for a malicious actor to come in and try and take advantage of that. So those were a couple of them. Another two I think are worth mentioning. One I think that we saw in particular at CyberSaint with some of our customers is that throughout the pandemic and some of the ensuing economic uncertainty that went along with it, in those companies where there were reductions in headcount, when that happened in risk teams, you might reduce the headcount, but you're not reducing the assessment workload, right? You still have to do these things at whatever regularity or cadence that's required by your regulators. So they really needed to find technologies that could streamline the process, bring everybody together into a standardized system of record. Some of the other capabilities I think that you gain, like standardization and just single pane of glass visibility. So that was another big one. And then probably the last one I'll mention here, I think has to do with vendors and vendor risk, which is such an important topic these days for obvious reasons. Typically the vendor assessment process for sure is only once a year, right? It's that contract renewal, if you're even doing that. And so your third party risk, because everyone's had to adapt to all this stuff in terms
Mhm.
of technical changes and process changes. So understanding where your vendor risk lies right now, I think, is going to be something organizations are having to wrap their heads around.
So true, and especially kind of kicking it back to the people element, right? Especially with the downsized risk teams that we see at CyberSaint, as well as just sort of the industry wide problem. It's not for sort of an overburdening of teams. I think that there are sort of business functions that you see sort of that you just suffer from this bloating issue of overstaffing.
Mm-hmm.
But coupled with the skill shortage, it has nothing to it. Correct me if I'm wrong, but from what I'm seeing, it's more so that there are so few people in the industry already that you're kind of overpaid, that you had to overpay to keep them there to begin with. And so it was not so much when you had to cut costs, you were losing one person, but one person who was doing probably 5 or 6 jobs.
Yeah, there's a lot of discussion around the people shortage, and one, I guess, interesting point. There's a book out there called the Fifth Dimension that they do a good job kind of describing what I'm going to attempt to say here, which is that we do have a skill shortage in one way, and in another way we don't. We have more and more colleges and community colleges that are pumping graduates out with degrees in cyber than we've ever had before, right? The reality. The problem is industry. That's not who industry wants to hire. They want to hire the people who've done this before, right? And maybe who have proved some of the soft skills that can be tough in cyber. Because if you might enter it thinking like, I want to work with technology, and I'll sit defending on my Linux machine, but it's a stressful job, and it can be irregular hours and last minute things, putting out fires. For everybody. So, the industry seems to want to hire people who have a whole bunch of certifications, who have been doing this for some time and have vetted themselves out. So yeah, those people, it's a good time to be in cyber.
And especially, I think kind of you get into getting back to sort of this remote work element. You're defining new processes. It's tricky to have sort of, and that's where, the reliance on more experienced people, whether or not, college degree aside, like the more experienced people you have, the more people who have been in those situations, and they're more, I don't want to say capable, but they're more adept at creating those new processes as it relates to remote work, because they've helped to create processes before.
Yeah, they've done it before. Yeah, it makes sense.
So, kind of shifting gears, I want to dive into a little bit more into remote work as a whole. I know, we talk a lot, as I said before, we kind of talk about the pandemic being sort of this great accelerator in the terms of business evolution, sort of between the rapid adoption of sort of classic digital transformation technologies like cloud, like we just covered. It's definitely sort of continuing on, even as we sort of enter this more sort of the vaccination period, especially in the US here. So that said, according to a survey by Remotely, 78% of employees expect remote work to become the new standard, and 97% don't want to return to the office full time at all. So kind of drilling that and sort of distilling that down more so specific to the security community, are you seeing similar trends, or sort of what are you seeing from the sort of the ear to the ground, boots on the ground side of things from a CSP perspective?
I feel like that's always been the case. And we can't argue it anymore. And there's probably a lot of factors that go into why that is. I mean, for one, security people tend to be comfortable with technology, right? There are also people who can, access a machine halfway across the world and make it look like they're coming from next door. So, the argument that it can't be done remotely, outside of things like culture, of the organization, stuff like that, the job can be done remotely. I mean, it's kind of hard to argue that it cannot, right? But I actually do think that's a trend, and I can say that both anecdotally and in practice. So anecdotally, prior to this webinar, I actually checked the job postings on CyberSN, just because they tend to have a lot of them and kind of to get a pulse. Almost all of them were, if not fully remote, some allowance of remote days, and that hasn't always been the case. So I think
for sure,
talent, you need that. But I'll also say, here at CyberSaint, we hire, really technical people. And when we go through and, talk to the recruiters that we work with, they're telling us you're not going to be competitive if you're not going to allow people to work remote. So, we've had a lot of success by doing that. And, It also, I think, maybe in a way, when we talk about the skills gap, that's a little bit inflated in certain areas. Like you have pockets of the country where there's lots of security talent. Big some cities, Boston and San Francisco and Seattle and New York and Austin are full of security people. But there's a lot of other places where you don't have many at all. And so this can maybe be a way of sort of evening that out a little bit by allowing folks to work from wherever works for them.
Definitely. And to kind of build on that element of both attracting and retaining talent, I want to drill specifically more so into the retaining end of things. I think that we've kind of seen this shift around conversations about secondary benefits that retain talent, not just necessarily compensation. It's more so around where am I able to work, when am I able to work? Those sorts of conversations catalyzed by a lot of different forces in the job market. Remote work being, as you said, kind of this critical element, especially for security folks that are more than capable of performing their job virtually. A lot of processes in place were pre-pandemic were kind of a la carte and kind of grew on their own and were really predicated on in-person interaction. And those sorts of process, executing an assessment or sort of performing those sorts of duties with those processes is now impossible, obviously, because we're not in the office. Can you speak a little bit to how organizations have had to sort of how these processes have evolved, not just from an efficiency standpoint, but from an employee retention perspective? I think we're starting to see, as you said, a lot of people who were participating and sort of supporting assessments it wasn't their job description.
Yeah, there's some interesting points there. I guess this probably doesn't get talked about all that much, but you talk to different people, you'll get different statistics of like what the average tenure is for somebody in security. The number of months differs, but it's on the lower side, right? Of tenure periods at a given company. And there's a lot of factors. You can jump from one company to another and get a big raise, but I think one part of it that's maybe not discussed all that much is burnout is a big thing in the industry. And a lot of what that comes from, I think, is the processes, right? That are in place, and that there's a lot of menial tasks. There's a lot of tracking people down to get the information that you need. Just the parts of the job that nobody really got into the business to do in the first place. So I do think there's something there. If you can reduce some of that friction, make it easier for folks to do their job, the job that they intended to do and that they're really good at, that it stands to reason that you might see some increased tenures over time. And so from CyberStain's perspective, there's a few ways that we do that. One is just by standardizing on a system of record. So instead of having to deal with sending out emails and CCing somebody's manager, all that access permissions, assigning things out, due dates, supporting evidence trails, all that stuff is in one place. So it just makes the process a lot easier. There's visibility across the organization for different stakeholders. But then taking that steps further, through hooking up different sources of telemetry from throughout the tech stack, we can actually automate some of the human intensive aspects of responding to assessments. So if you can identify some controls or some control families where maybe you don't want to have to go and ask somebody to print out the configuration screenshot, maybe we can pull that from some other system automatically at some frequency. Remove that annoying step in the process, right? Another big one for us is around crosswalking, right? We talked at the beginning about how a lot of the frameworks and standards that we assess against, they're saying the same thing, just in different ways. Crosswalking allows you the ability to assess yourself against one robust framework or standard, and then overlay the results of that onto others in an automated way, so you can see, and measure where you stand, and cut down some of that duplicative effort. So those types of increases in efficiencies and automation, absolutely, I think will have an impact on employee retention.
So I kind of want to dive, and especially from an integrated perspective, right? Looking at how sort of IRM is shifting the way we kind of think about the sort of risk and compliance function at large. I think that it's kind of it's an ongoing evolving thing, and especially as it relates to your point, a lot of the acts of sort of the retention process of how are you going to improve processes, not just from a business efficiency perspective, but also from an employee retention perspective. This is kind of that state of flux that we all kind of find ourselves in. this is an opportunity for organizations, and I think that security leaders are seeing that, to be able to both standardize, as you said, as well as kind of reimagine those processes in a more integrated way that isn't kind of this modular siloed approach that, like it served its purpose, but at the same time, we've kind of evolved past it. And I think that from my conversations, correct me if I'm wrong, from yours, a lot of security leaders were looking at that and saying, it's something that I want to change. I just don't know how to do it.
Absolutely. And it's any business process that's been done the same way for a while is probably ripe for an evaluation of whether there's some digital transformation that can come in and bring some, added efficiencies. And we see that, we have, we talk to not just security leaders and risk leaders, but we also talk to teams that are charged with finding disruptive technologies to bring greater efficiencies to some manual processes that have existed in some cases for decades without being changed.
Mm-hmm. And so, getting back to kind of the technology as end of things, we have adopted, like we're kind of hitting it again, but as adopted a lot of new technologies as a result of the rise of remote work due to the pandemic. We've seen companies that were thinking about cloud and kind of aspired to, probably maybe start a cloud project by 2030, and suddenly that, started last year.
Right.
Can you kind of speak to the feasibility with this new influx of technologies coming in, speak to the feasibility of conducting assessments kind of in the old way, especially from whether that's spreadsheets or even from a modular GRC perspective? Do you think that what is the feasibility of conducting assessments in the way that we used to? And is it even possible at this point with the amount of new technologies we have?
Not effective, not efficiently, right? Cloud's a good example because a lot of the cloud service providers, they've even mapped some of the sources of telemetry you can gain from cloud native services to control sets. So like there's already sort of an understanding and an association between these kind of disparate functions, but that exists in itself in a silo, right? Because it would be a very small minority of companies that would be able to just leverage what's coming out of the cloud service provider that they use and have that assessment. I mean, that doesn't take into account any of the people and process stuff. Really, it's really just it's more the technical controls. So yeah, by hooking up with those types of data feeds, and then as we touched on a little bit earlier, through integration, whether that be with cloud feeds or with whatever security tech stack. I mean, the truth is we've been doing that for a long time, just in a different purpose. We've been sending all those feeds to SIMs in order to look for indicators of compromise. Why not leverage that same data, but apply it to sort of a risk lens instead, and automate to the extent that we can do that. The other thing I wanted to just kind of mention here, I think it's the right place to talk about it, is to bring back up that vendor case.
For sure.
And I probably, I've been on both sides of it, but these days I'm on the receiving end of a lot of vendor questionnaires because I'm on the team out here, right? It's really amazing to me sometimes how many vendor assessments get sent out that are cookie cutter, and you can tell that they're from a long time ago because they don't take into account the fact that probably most of the technology that organizations are buying these days, well, at least from an application perspective, are cloud-based, right? So if you're assessing your vendors and you want to do that due diligence and actually have the right information to understand where your risk lies from a third-party perspective, I think it's really important to spend some time taking a look at what questions we're actually asking in those questionnaires. Because if you have a cloud application or some type of technology that you're looking at, and your questionnaire has 25 questions about data center physical security, you're not asking the right questions, right? You won't be asking about identity and access management and encryption and which security services you have turned on and how often they're monitored, and rotation of access keys and stuff. You don't really want to be asking so much about some of the physical security data center requirements. So I just wanted to mention that because it's something I see a lot, and I think unfortunately by using that, maybe people are accustomed to it, they've been using it for a long time, not giving you the information that you really need to understand where your risk lies in terms of vendor.
And I think, then, drilling into sort of how like remote work at large, it's the second order effect of technology adoption, specifically cloud-based technology adoption. And you're starting to see I would argue this concept of kind of vendor risk getting escalated to the point of like internal risk management, whether that's cyber IT, whatever that looks like, where vendor risk was kind of this standalone thing. I think as a result of the rise of remote work pandemic, you're seeing companies start to recognize that they are in point of fact an ecosystem. They're not an island that, as we saw with SolarWinds, that the supply chain, if you're not protecting your supply chain, if you're not taking your supply chain as seriously as you are your internal controls, then you're just as vulnerable as if you weren't paying attention to the controls at all.
We're all in this mess together.
Exactly. So I think that's a borderline optimistic place to land the plane, and sort of this idea of we're all in this together. But especially so for those playing at home, Steve, any parting thoughts as we kind of start to wrap things up and sort of think about from an IRM perspective why remote work has sort of been this major driving force?
Yeah, I mean, I think IRM really is kind of it's a process. It's a philosophy in certain ways that differs from how we've done things in the past. And the benefit to it, though, is that if you're taking an integrated approach, regardless of the circumstances around you, the focus is going to be on, making decisions based on risk. So that risk changes when you have a pandemic and everyone has to go, back to work from home. That risk changes as asset values change and vulnerabilities change. Technology changes, people and process change. We want to be really adaptive to that type of just ever evolving sort of atmosphere. And technologies like CyberStrong can really help enable that in a very visible way that can, really make a big difference in terms of integrating risk into organizational culture, giving executives and powers that be really the ones who are charged with setting organizational risk tolerance, the information they need to effectively do that job. So
for sure, definitely stay dynamic. All right, Steve. Well, it has, as always, it's a pleasure. And for those watching, thank you so much for joining us today. We will be adding attachments to this talk once the recording is available later this afternoon. Thank you so much for attending. Feel free to submit any questions. If you'd like to learn more about CyberStrong's cyber risk automation functionality, our NLP-backed cross-mapping ability as well, feel free to reach out, info@cybersaint.io, or feel free to browse at cybersaint.io. Steve, as always, it's a pleasure. And we'll talk to you soon.
All right. Thanks, Ethan. Talk soon.
Take care.